with me. We were in NAMI at that time. She prepared this PowerPoint on several occasions. I've made a few adaptations along the way, but she, Adriana, is from Argentina, from the southern part of Argentina. She worked in Fiji for 6 years as a missionary. She came, did some studies here at CTU, went back to Argentina. She is now the provincial of the Southern Province in Argentina for the SSBS. Her and I are the co-chairs of the committee on the Resource Committee on Interculturality for our two congregations. That committee consists of 5 SPDs and 5 SSBS from around the world. And Adriana and I do a lot of work together. Right now we're planning a big program for December, an 8-day program for maybe 40 different religious congregations. So anyways, I just want to acknowledge this. The picture on the right this is a course that we did in NAMI in 2017. And this was a 3-week program. We did it bilingually, English and Spanish, and 3 weeks for formation and interculturality. This group of people here, there are 14 of the 17 novice directresses of the SSBS, and there's 15 SPDs who are involved in formation work. So this is a program that we did together in 2017, January. So just again, that was focused on formation. This past January, we did something on spirituality. So different aspects of our life together. So we've done this. You may recognize a few people in that picture. I don't know how clearly you can see it. Huh? Okay. Sounds like somebody has not muted. Huh? I can hear a little noise in the background. Okay. So we begin. The Word was made flesh. Of course, we are very familiar with this from the prologue of John, which is so important for our own congregation. Jesus was made flesh, became flesh. Christ became flesh in a very particular place. Fully human and fully divine. Being fully human, he took flesh in a very particular place. He wasn't a universal person. He was a concrete person. He learned a certain language. He lived in a particular geographical space during a very limited amount of time, 33 years that we say. Huh? So he took flesh in a very particular context. Huh? Now, in all cultures, when we're born into all cultures, we started talking about this yesterday in terms of the iceberg and things like that. This is an image I've again drawn from Tony Gittins and from another book that he wrote. And this is sort of taken from the social sciences. So cultures basically look at the world as us and them. I'm talking culturally now. Obviously, this is not just ethnicity. This also applies to other things as well. In the us category, there are those who are the participant insiders in a culture, and there are non-participant insiders in a culture. I'm going to explain that a bit more in that way. The them, people of the others, there are the participant outsiders, and there are the non-participant outsiders. And what we're doing in this first presentation is to see how did Jesus move from being, he was a participant insider as a male in his society, how he moved from there to the non-participant insiders through table fellowship. But then we're going to focus more on how he crossed this line and he engaged those who were the participant outsiders and the non-participant outsiders, women of other cultures, for example. Okay. Now this is our challenge as well. Within our own culture, there are the participant insiders, the non-participants, and there are the thems, huh? Us and thems. Huh? And this polarity of us and thems is what interculturality is addressing in a broad sense that we talked about yesterday. This is an image that Adriana shared. She worked in Bariloche in southern Argentina before she became provincial. And here's an image from Bariloche, the town in Argentina. I don't know if any of you, I know some of you have worked in Argentina before. I think, Paul, you worked there, I think, Paul Scott, Joe Scott. But anyways, you can see this is the same town. So this is one part of the town where people are living in this type of situation. And you just go a couple blocks over and this is the tourist side of the town. Huh? So the us and them categories, the participant insiders, the non-participant insiders, in that way. So in terms of economics. Now this fundamental distinction between us insiders and them outsiders, on a positive side, it provides groups a space to nurture their own culture, to cultivate their environment, to create and hand on particular pattern of meanings which constitute their specific cultures. In other words, culture is important, us and them, for the sake of meaning, identity, and order. It gives a sense of meaning and belonging that all human beings need. So on a positive side, identifying who we are. So our own culture, we are to be proud of that. That is something that is a good thing. It's important for us. Because some people ask me, does that mean when we talk about interculturality, I have to deny my own culture? No, we honor our culture. The problem is when we use our culture to judge others. So the cultural flow is that this opportunity to choose, separate, and set boundaries, us and them, becomes at the same time a source of exclusion, domination, discrimination, control, privilege, and hierarchy. Steve Evans was reflecting on this on, I think it was Tuesday of this week, when the readings that we had were talking about walls, the different types of walls. And Pope Francis has also talked about walls in his most recent document. So that's what happens. Identity is one thing, but then we use it as a way of exclusion and control over others. Tony Gittins quote here, cultures are built on the lattice work of separation and division, classification and categorization, discrimination and dominion. So this is the thing with societies, the us, them categories, and we do this, and we can see this in the US, but this applies every place. I do a lot of work internationally, and other people say this is for us the same, no matter what part of the world we're in. So if we go back to that framework of the participant insiders, so those us, this is taken from the time of Jesus. We can translate it today, but if we look at the time of Jesus, the insiders, participants of the Jewish community, these were the adult males, the VIPs, the holders of authority, legitimate and power, strength, control, and dominance. When we talk about interculturality, we must talk about power. And this is something that my Latin American colleagues have really taught me very much. They said, you in North America, you talk about interculturality as this sort of nice, sort of everybody getting on with each other in different cultures, but you got to talk about the power dynamics between people of different cultures, or the us and them, again, beyond ethnicity. Who are the others, significant others? Heads of households, members of professions, physicians, bankers, lawyers, clergy, teachers, the Pharisees, the appointed leaders, and those who have power of sanction, of authority, military, police, religious authorities. We know the conflicts that Jesus had with the religious authorities of his time. So these are the participant insiders. Jesus did interact with them. He did. He challenged them. He challenged them in the sense that if they took their of authority to exclude other people. And then we move to the next box below that. These are the non-participant insiders of Jesus' culture. These are the non-adult males, or people considered nobodies, people without authority or no social identity, limited powers. They may not be completely powerless, but limited. There's different degrees to non-participation. Others are the immature, the unborn. Of course, this whole question of the abortion, lacking viability, infants, children. These are people who are the non-participants. And we know that how that happens. Mentally, those who are considered outside, morally, women in general, especially at the time of Jesus. Again, there's some, non-participating males. Jesus did, huh? And so Jesus reaching out to them in his own culture, the Jewish peoples, mentally, those who were roaming around in graveyards, who were possessed or whatever you call them, the criminals, the sinners, the tax collectors. Even though they were males, they were considered on the outside of the Jewish culture. Mostly women also within his own culture, and the non-participating adults. We'll talk more about this afternoon around the images of table fellowship. We'll come back to this later on. That's how Jesus related to people within the Jewish culture, but also including those who were the participants and non-participants. So Jesus was deeply moved by the experience of God's option for the little ones, Matthew 11:25. That experience made him move counterculturally to the lower margins of his society. So within his society, from participant to non-participant, as Jesus moved from the position he was born with to where he reached out. Because Jesus filled up how the boundaries that gave them privileges on this earth were making them exclude themselves from God's kingdom, where there are no lines of division or exclusion. So Jesus confronted that people who considered them specialized, and we know through, we heard this in the parables and Jesus' own teaching, that he was warning the scribes and Pharisees. It's not that all the scribes and Pharisees were bad, but many of them used their authority in order to exclude or call other people impure. So again, we're back to these categories of the us, participants, non-participants. We've already talked about how Jesus moved from here where he was born as a male. He moved here, across here. We'll talk more about this afternoon. But today we're going to stretch even further. We're going to cross this line. How did Jesus connect with the participant outsiders? Roman centurion, for example, we'll hear about that. And in particular, we're going to focus on the non-participant outsiders through two particular incidences. Okay, you see what we're doing here? Interculturality calls us to move beyond these sort of boundaries of the us and them categories. This is within our religious congregation. I've seen it within our own SVDs, and it's also within our ministry, and it's certainly within our society. So how do we move in this way? Jesus is showing us the way. So I'm going to use three biblical icons. This is the language that Adriana used. By the way, Adriana did a lot of study in exegesis and the scriptures as well behind all this. So we're going to look at three particular icons. The first is that of the Canaanite woman, or she's called the Syro-Phoencian woman, a transformative encounter. Now we're already familiar with this encounter, so I'm just going to go through this rather quickly, and then we'll highlight a few of the phrases that I've listed here in bold. Jesus is going through a territory of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman came out shouting to him, calling out to him, "Have pity on me, my daughter is full of demons." Here's a mother concerned for her daughter who is possessed. It's spiritual, maybe a mental problem that the child has. She's calling out to him. She's a Canaanite. She's non-Jewish. Syro-Phoencian woman in another synoptic gospel. Jesus did not say a word. He's silent. She kept calling out. Now the disciples get on and say, "Send her away." She comes and nails me, please help me, Lord. Then we have the phrase in verse 26. It isn't right to take away from children and feed it to the dogs. This very term that Jesus used, a derogatory term. And this is the term that came from his culture, the term that was used. That's true, the woman says, but even dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the owner's table. Then, verse 28, this is very important. Something happens to Jesus. He now is not just seeing a woman who is bugging him, disturbing his plans, or bothering him. And again, what I'm doing here is looking at the human side of Jesus. I'm not denying the divinity, of course. I'm looking at it from the human side in terms as a cultural person as he was, fully human also. Dear woman, you really do have a lot of faith, and you will be given what you want. Jesus recognizes in the other, the stranger, a person of faith. At that moment, the daughter was healed. The Canaanite or Syro-Phoencian woman is an outsider to Jesus' cultural and religious group. It's cultural and religious. As an insider, Jesus responded to her call at the beginning with the hurtful silence. He didn't say a word. Then later on, disciples were annoyed, and Jesus then said, I was only sent to the people of Israel, to my people. And later he added, it isn't right to take food away from children and feed it to dogs. Huh? We know ethnocentrism is out there, in so many different ways. And we could add many, many more slides to this of what's been going on in the last year or so in this country, but around the world in that way. So ethnocentrism is out there, but it's also within us. We constantly have to look at what is that, the us and them categories that we use. I'm 69 years old, and I keep finding these new categories of us and them that I face, ready to jump out when we least think about it, how that can surface at different times, We know this, The challenge of the other. The non-edited, impolite words that Jesus addressed to the woman encourages us to confront ourselves with honesty. I realize some of you might not be comfortable with me saying that Jesus used, impolite words towards this woman. Adriana has done a lot more study in looking at what the scripture scholars say about that use of that term. And it certainly was a derogatory term. And yet Jesus overcomes it. And that's, for me, that's what we can learn. Jesus, as a cultural person, he had the us and them categories. And there was that struggle within him because he knew that God was bigger than that. And he overcomes it. And he does reach out to the woman. His willingness to answer her question and broaden his vision are a challenge to our own ethnocentrism. To me, that is what we can learn so much from this. Jesus was willing to move beyond his initial silence. I'm only going to Israel. And in terms of, the food is only not for dogs. So who is the stranger in your own context, in your current experience, ministry, and community? Now, it might not be as stark as with the Syro-Phoencian woman, but can you identify the minority groups who live among you? And again, this applies within the SPDs as well. When were you confronted with the blindness of your vision because of your prejudices against a stranger? This is something for all of us. As I mentioned yesterday, I've been doing a lot more work and reading about anti-racism. And it's just, it continues to challenge myself. How can I accompany others if I don't face it within myself? What prejudices, cultural blindness, or barriers have been exposed through such an event? And what is the other asking you? What are her, his, or their needs? Message of the story. As a result of this encounter with the Canaanite woman, Jesus grew in his own understanding of the inclusivity and radical equality of God's reign. It's easy to have the theology, but what does it mean concretely? but the people we are with. In a radical way, enriching. Yesterday we talked about the Black Lives Matter issue. I mean, these are big challenges. What we're talking about today with Jesus is the ideal, to overcome any kind of us, them categories, and to see that all people, and to treat people in that way. Wainwright, one of the scripture scholars, she writes, she taught him, the woman taught Jesus, a recognition that linked her insight into wholeness with that of God, whose way, whose dream Jesus was to establish on earth. In a way, the woman was a prophet of the stranger. She was a stranger who was a prophet to Jesus. And again, this may be a little different way that we've thought about this in the past, but she was a stranger. She was a different culture. As a woman, we're crossing the gender too. Remember when we talked yesterday that culture is not just ethnicity, but also our social location, men and women, rich and poor. She's not given a name in the story. She's shown to be interrupting Jesus in Mark and annoying the disciples in Matthew. However, she did not play the victim's card. In other words, she didn't just sort of pull off into a corner and say, poor me. She was concerned for her daughter. We can also imagine the courage, the inner strength, the commitment, the guts, the wit that the woman must have had. These are the very traits that reflect the divine gifts that are needed in order to bring about God's all-inclusive and egalitarian project. What we're doing here is we're not just looking at what Jesus said and did, we're also sort of stepping into the shoes of the woman. And again, we don't know exactly what was going on, but what it was for her, how difficult it was for her, even though she was ignored and shunned and called by a derogatory term, she kept on. Her faith was there and her concern for her daughter. Okay, we're going to move to the second icon. I won't be spending as much time on the second and third as I did on the first. The second is that of the engagement of the encounter. Pope Francis talks about encounter. This is certainly another encounter, as was the first. The encounter with the Samaritan woman. And from the focus of creating alternating spaces. There are many ways of looking at this parable, at this story. Creating. So Jesus goes to the well of Jacob. This is already crossing boundaries. He is crossing through outside his own comfort zone. He was tired. He sat down. It was noon. Samaritan woman came to draw water from the well. I can't go into all the social context. People have said, why is she coming at noon to get water? Was she sort of seen as an outsider in a village? Noon is not the time you'd normally in the heat. As those of you know, if you're living in the tropics, you don't go then at that time. Jesus asked her, would you please give me a drink of water? And she knows who he is by his dress and language. You are a Jew. I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink of water? Jews and Samaritans won't have anything to do with each other. So there's the difference here, men and women, culturally and religiously. Eventually, we skip to verse 19. The woman, after their initial sharing back and forth, talking about the water, she recognizes him as a prophet. In terms of her own religious identity, she says, my ancestors worshiped on the mountain. But you Jews say that Jerusalem is the only place to worship. Okay, where do we worship? What's our religious? What's our spirituality? Jesus said to her, believe me, the time is coming when you won't worship the Father, either on the mountains or in Jerusalem. The time is coming already here. Even now, true worshipers are being led by the Spirit to worship the Father. These are the ones the Father is seeking to worship him. God is Spirit. And then we move into the theological. She recognizes him as or thinks that he may be the Messiah. Okay. So something has happened in this way. The disciples come back and they wonder what Jesus is doing talking. Why is Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman? So in this conversation, through this dialogue back and forth, Jesus not only crosses national, cultural, religious, and gender barriers, the Samaritans are considered half Jews. Historically, they are related, but there was that division that happened in the Hebrew scriptures. We hear about that. But he's engaging the Samaritan woman also in a theological quest. So that's what we're going to skip to. We can talk about the cultural, religious, the gender, how many husbands she's had, all of that. Again, the holistic picture. But if we focus on that last one now, the theological quest, in terms of their deepest true identity and call. What happens in this conversation as we get towards the end is that they discover that in their own religious searching and yearning, rather than either or, either the mountains or Jerusalem as a place of worship, it's both and. So as shown in that image here, God is worshipped in the temple, as we know from the Jewish tradition, later in the synagogues. And God is worshipped in high places, the mountaintops, as the Samaritans. Jesus is saying God is to be worshipped in spirit and in truth. So again, what happens with this encounter with the other? Jesus is being stretched. Jesus is being enriched. Jesus is enriching the other to understand that God is bigger than our own categories, even our religious categories and our spirituality, that God is bigger than we know. Again, it doesn't take away from our own religious traditions, our good Jewish religious traditions, our good Samaritan religious traditions. But wait a minute, how can we appreciate the religious and spirituality of the other? Of course, this applies to us in our own, with our confreres, and also in our ministry. A true intercultural encounters expands our image of God. The Spirit inspires us and moves us toward new spaces of encounter, Pope Francis' term. Dialogue, freedom, and mission. Spaces of both and paradoxes of intercultural life. So in other words, that both and categories that we need to recognize in this way. Very powerful. And we're going to talk more about this tomorrow too. How are we enriched by the spirituality of our fellow confreres, or by the spirituality of the people that we serve in ministry? How does this happen? God is bigger than we think. Again, we don't deny our own spirituality. It's stretched in a good sense. The third icon we're going to use is that of the Good Samaritan parable, identifying with the stranger and reaching out with a merciful heart, a heart of compassion. So identifying with the stranger. An expert of the law, somebody who is a participant insider in Jesus' own culture. He asked Jesus the question, what must I do to have eternal life? Okay, and Jesus asked him what is in the scriptures. And of course, the man knows it perfectly. And he says, you've given the right answer in verse 28. Verse 29, but the man wanted to show that he knew what he was talking about, He felt secure. He felt secure in what he was doing. So he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? Jesus replied with the parable that we know so well. A man going from Jerusalem to Jericho is attacked, robbed, left for half dead, very seriously beaten up. A priest happens to go by. A priest is an insider participant in Jesus' culture. Later, a temple helper came to the same space. Again, somebody who is a participant insider in the culture. And they both walk by. Part of the concerns of walking by is if they would have attended to him, that means that they probably would have been ritually impure themselves, and they would have had to go through a ritual in order to re-enter the temple again. That's just part of the social context. Whatever the case is, they did not help. Then a man from Samaria, a Samaritan, a half Jew, if I use that language, he came traveling along the road. He saw the man. He felt sorry for him, compassion, mercy. He treated his wounds, took care of him, put him on his donkey, took him to an inn. Next day, he goes the extra step. I have to move on in my trip, but please, here's some money to take care of him, and I'll stop by on my way back. He's certainly going way beyond the call of duty, the call of human duty, but he's following a much deeper duty. Which of these people was a real neighbor? Going back to the religious specialist, the one who showed pity. Jesus said, go and do the same. This is amazing. Jesus is using a Samaritan as the ideal disciple. He's using a non-Jew as the disciple. This is an unbelievable that he did this. Huh? Unbelievable. To take someone who's considered an outsider that's the disciple. Abraham was a person of mercy, huh? The other. Jesus reversed the terms of the question and he challenged the lawyer's social location, his social location of authority and power, his religious worldview, and the context from where he was asking the question. This is where we see Jesus challenging the participant insiders in his own culture with this question. And he's telling him to look from the us to the thems. With the parable, Jesus invited him to cross the boundaries of his privileged position and encounter a countercultural logic. Jesus challenged the lawyer to drawing his attention to the victims of the road. Take a look at them, see them. As Mother Teresa saw those who were laying in the gutters in Calcutta. Look for those who are the excluded ones. And he pointed towards the outsiders. So he's both looking at the victims within one's own culture, but he's also pointing to the outsiders as the example to be imitated. This is amazing. And again, when I say this, we are to follow Jesus. Implied in the story is a crucial clue that the lawyer did not miss. It was compassion which made this double movement possible and even desirable. Within our own culture and then stepping outside of our own culture. Again, remember, culture is bigger than just ethnicity. What does this mean for us? What does this mean for us? This is a very strong quote from Tony Gittins. You see that I draw a lot on Tony Gittins' work. Because humanity has become so scandalously separated and opposed, we individually and corporately must make a choice. Either we choose to continue sinning by exclusion, separation, and boundary maintenance, and every day eat and drink judgment to ourselves, or, second choice, we resolve today to embrace God's radical option for humanity, and with God's help and our steadfastness to change our lives. There is no third way. This is what interculturality entails. This is a very strong statement. I know my recent reading in terms of racism, it's like we're not talking about being non-racist, but being anti-racist. So there's a choice on which way we stand. Intentional. The future of humanity and of the church may depend on this, the choice that we make. We talked about it yesterday, saying that religious communities, but others too, if they don't go the route of the interculturality and what it requires and what we're talking about here, they may not survive. Only when we dare to move downward to the margins and outward towards the stranger, downwards to the margins within our own culture, outward to the stranger, the thems, we truly discover who we are and what we are called to be as disciples of Jesus. In the encounter with the other, both persons meet in a new space. This is what we saw with Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. The place of compassion for all, the Good Samaritan. As a radically inclusive of God's kingdom, it's the disciples' challenge to move downwards and outwards, making themselves neighbors with others. However, it is their privilege and grace to be received as neighbors when their boundary crossing makes them strangers in other people's situations of lands. So sometimes we're on either side of this. We can be on the us. Sometimes we're moving into the world of the thems. We can be in both ways. And when we do that, we become strangers in that way. As the road between Jericho and Jerusalem is a dangerous but life-changing journey. Okay, I'm going to stop here now with this presentation. This afternoon, we'll continue on with what does this mean for the early church and for us as disciples. So at this point, I think I'll take off the screen here. Let's see, do I need this? And so that we can do some of the Q&A, huh? All right. So I don't know if anyone, I see now that, okay, there's just in the chat room right now, we just have the comment from Doing. We're not going to spend as much time this morning as we did yesterday on the Q&A, so that you can follow your schedule that you have it here. So we're just going to spend a bit of time here now. I guess until 10:30 your time. Okay, so we do have some time here. Okay.
Is there any question that anybody would like to ask? You can unmute yourself and ask the question. Peter, you raise your hand. Go ahead, Peter.
Okay. So thank you, Roger, for the beautiful presentation. And it's always a challenge to preach Jesus as a learner, and especially if you want to be consistent with the whole gospel, how the gospels presented Jesus. And today we have two stories, and Jesus actually in the second story, Samaritan woman, and Jesus take an initiative to preach or comprehend that Jesus is the one who have been transformed. That's my question. How do you reconcile the two stories?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is for us to reconcile the stories for ourselves. Then how do we preach it? That's the other challenge, huh? Because it depends on the context of the congregation and things like that, of course, you know. So one thing is for ourselves, but I think it's really important to see. One way that I would talk about, then I'd invite you, Steve, if you have some further thoughts on this, is that I would see God's Spirit working on both sides. God's Spirit in that first story with the Syro-Phoencian woman is you find God's Spirit working amongst that woman. And she's reaching out and she's trying to find the fullness of life for her daughter. And she is a person of faith. And so she's reaching out to Jesus. Eventually, Jesus also then responds and also sees that the Spirit of God is working in her. So God is working on both sides. It's not just one directional. In the story of the Samaritan woman on the well, Jesus takes the initiative and he encounters her. And he also then is obviously filled with God's Spirit, but she is also filled with God's Spirit. She's a woman of faith. And so it's also working with her. And she's then drawn to Jesus. So what I would say is that all of us, both as missionaries and the people that we are ministering to, or as co-missionaries, as missionaries in the same congregation, that Spirit of God is working on both sides, huh? And the Spirit of God is calling us all to recognize who God is, where do we worship, how do we worship, huh? We're all called to go beyond our us and them categories. I think that story of the Syro-Phoencian woman is challenging because people don't like to think that Jesus had to change. Huh? But if we believe that Jesus was fully human and fully divine, he also had to do that. Now, people in the congregation may not be ready to hear that part of the story. However, I think we can talk beautifully about that first story of how God's Spirit was working both amongst the woman and with Jesus. And at the end, what happened? The girl was healed. Huh? Yeah, the fullness of life came. Again, how you preach that, that's our challenge that we have as preachers. Huh? But I think for us to recognize, and as for missionaries, before Vatican II, spirituality of missionaries was like, I mean, this is being, just putting it in very simply, it's like our spirituality is like we fill our backpack. We sort of have a battery pack on our back and we get spilled up with our spirituality. We go out amongst the people, we get drained, we come back again and sort of get charged up again. Huh? But the spirituality after Vatican II says God's Spirit is working there and here. And so when we encounter the other, we also are encountering God's grace at work there as well. Huh? So there's that mutuality, and I think that can be very helpful. Yesterday, I talked about Vincent Dunham and Christianity Rediscovered. Huh? Yeah. Okay, Peter. Okay, Steve, you want to add something there? Steve?
Well, I was just thinking about, one of certainly my favorite passages in the Bible, and I think it's a really important one. It goes very much together with the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, which is so important for us SVDs, is Philippians 2. That some people say the real translation of that should be not although he was in the likeness of God, but because he was in the likeness of God, he emptied himself. As one biblical scholar says, this shows the character of God. To be God is not to hold on to majesty and power and all that stuff, but to be fully giving and fully self-emptying. And so for Jesus to become flesh means that Jesus really emptied himself. And that's his divinity, is the emptying.
Right.
And then Jesus, as God, enters into the very fabric of the world and learns from the world. He had to learn language. He had to learn culture. He had to learn manners. And here's an example where he's learning humanity. So I think that's, in terms of the Syro-Phoencian woman particularly, it's a really good example of what God is like. That God is God in God's emptiness and openness.
Thank you, Steve. And there for us as disciples are to do the same. That giving, that self-giving love is to come in that way. I received a chat from John here, and he just made a comment about the relationship with secularism. It's the same thing, because people ask me this question. I don't know, John, do you want to restate your question or?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to say that, you're talking about the encounter in space, the space encounter there. My whole time in Ghana, I was, of course, focused more and more always on learning other languages and cultures, and from my own experience trying to help others. And the more I did that, of course, the more I saw how, especially in the North, where I was working with traditional believers, how grace was working through their lives in simple ways that we hadn't seen yet. And that became very clear to me as I learned the culture more and more. And coming back to the United States now, and having to relearn American culture or piecemeal parts and all the parts that exist in American culture. Yeah. And trying to approach it in the same way, that try to see where those grace presence of God is in those pieces. I'm starting to see it just now, a little bit after being 12 years back. What I see also is that the church is not fully engaged in that, hardly at all. And things like women and the gender issues and all the JPIC issues and so forth. Church is often at another, one end of the exclusion. In fact, secular society in many ways can teach us, as the Phoenician woman taught Jesus. I'm wondering what you want to say about that, have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very good, John. And I mean, in terms of secular society, secular society, that takes a wide range. It could be, agnostic on one end, but there are more people, I think, that are in this other area. They're just tired of official religion and they're still searching for spirituality and that sort of thing. I think we can see that very true. And in the same way, where people who are not members or participants or believers in a particular religion, and yet how God's Spirit is certainly working with them. And how do we find a way of encountering that, secular person sitting at the well or sitting in the marketplace or at Starbucks, or how do we engage them? In the same way, God's Spirit is working there, but how do we connect? What did Jesus do with the Samaritan woman at the well? How did he connect with her at the beginning? With her daily life. Tell me about your life. Tell me about your husband. Tell me about, how do you start there? And then that conversation led them on. Now, of course, that parable that story, you fast forward fairly quickly. That doesn't happen in daily life so quickly. But how do we engage people on a human level and recognizing that God is certainly, they may not use the word God, they may not be comfortable in that way, but certainly God is stirring in the hearts of all people. People make choices. They can reject it. They can do evil. We all can do that. But again, I agree with you very much that, that we have to talk also about secular society. And that's so much of what we're about today. How do we engage that? Huh? How do we do that? Huh? Okay, I see Melvin James has a remark to make there. Melvin, you want to unmute yourself? Okay, good. Hello, Melvin. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Yeah, hi, Roger.
Good. Hi, Melvin.
Who would have thought back in Epworth days you would be where you are and I am where I am.
That's right.
But I'm sitting near Paul Smith, so that's a little bit of Epworth history.
Okay.
Paul.
I think you may have to, if there's another computer on.
That's Paul Smith. I think he turned it off.
Okay, now it's clear. Yeah, go ahead, Melvin.
Okay. As an African American and the Syro-Phoencian woman, I recognize something that many others do not recognize. Jews did something similar to what we African Americans do, and that is play the dozens. You know what that is, Roger?
Play the dozens, you said?
Yeah.
Help me out.
Black people do this. It's like, oh, your mother's so fat, she stepped on a dollar bill and she got change.
Mm-hmm.
And the other guy comes back, well, your mother's so old, she was the waitress at the Last Supper. And
Right.
You just play it on and on until one says something and the other one has no comeback.
Yeah.
And then the one that has no comeback wins. When Jesus said it's not right to take the food and throw it to the dogs, we recognize that he was playing with her.
Yeah.
He was having fun. It wasn't being negative, and she came back. But even the dogs get the food that falls from it. And
Yeah.
Jesus said, you beat me, lady. And I could see the apostles in the background laughing. She got the master. She got him. And therefore you won and you get what you asked for. And you talk about intercultural. So we come at these scriptures from different points of view. And I just wanted to throw mine in there. Don O'Connor and I argue about this kind of stuff all the time.
Okay.
He's one of the brothers in the community wants to argue scripture with me. So I give it to you, Roger, as my little gift today. Good to see you.
This is
Thank you,
typically
Melvin.
African as well. This is very typically African.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I thank you, Melvin, very much. And I think the point I think there are several things. I mean, I there's several things. I think it's very important. Yesterday, Steve Evans talked about the importance that Bible sharing can have for us in terms of
You can turn yours back on.
Okay. And, you know, how we, through scripture sharing, we can turn off one of those mics, one of the computers there. Melvin, can you?
Mute, please.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so like Steve was saying yesterday, through our Bible sharing, it's really important. We can learn more about ourselves, we share our faith, our different perspectives and things like that. The other thing that I've heard people talk about too, Melvin, in terms of this is the resilience of the woman, you know, that she was very persistent, and it shows the resilience that she had in her own, you know, admiring her in that regards as well. So thank you very much, Melvin, for your comment. Yeah. Okay, Steve, did you want to add anything here or? Okay, all right. Let's see here. Anyone else have any comments or questions at this point? Okay, I see, it looks like Ben Lay. Was that a hand?
Yes, Father Herman has a comment, a question. So I'm going to send it through the text. Actually, I can read it too. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay. So this is his comment. I've been ministering to the Native Americans in San Diego for some time, and when I reach out to those who seldom come to church, they turn me down because of what the Catholic Church has done to them in the past. They have not up to this time recovered from the atrocities that we have done to them. So any comments on that?
I can speak. I myself have been, for the last 30 years, I've been have a relationship with some of the people in the Lakota people in South Dakota. Those who are students here at CTU, you know, and I've been going there since 1991, taking students there. And this is up in the Rosebud and Pine Ridge reservations in Southwest South Dakota. And there they, you know, they have Wounded Knee there, as you all know. This is where there's a massacre of men, women, and children in 1890. That's the site of that's on the reservation where we go. Native Americans are not allowed to practice their religious rituals until 1976. They're forbidden by the government. The church also is very much against that. So when we started going back there to the reservation, of course, some people remember that and that. Huh? Now there are those who, and I guess history of what has happened in that way. And at the beginning, some people were very angry, and in some ways, as a white U.S. citizen, as a man, and as a Catholic priest, all of these people who were part of what happened. And then what happened there is, you know, to develop sort of a trust, but it takes time. And at some points, I might have to just sit there and just let people say, this is what happened, this is what happened. They repeat it over and over again. And in a way, it provides people a spot where they can talk and share, this is what happened in my life, or this is what happened to our people. In other words, allow people to really listen to their story. And we may have to listen to that story a number of times. But then at some points, hopefully, there are some people who may be ready at that point to say, okay, let's talk now as individual to individual. And I've experienced that on the reservation. I experienced this in Papua New Guinea too. There are people, after ordination, I was assigned to a parish. There had been, the priest before me had been sexually involved with the wife of a teacher. So when I arrived there, they're like, well, we can't trust any priest anymore because of what you do. So I had to go around and just let people tell me over and over again why they're frustrated with the church, why they're frustrated with this priest, why they're frustrated. Eventually with time, some of the people would say, okay, now we're ready to listen to what the church has to say. But it takes time and relationships and listening to people, respecting their experience, not denying it, but how do we listen to it in that way? So I think that's the challenge Again, there are other ways of dealing with trauma of memories. That requires often somebody that's a little more professional in this way. How do we find reconciliation in terms of the memories we have of such atrocities? This is a big issue, and what I've just said now, I'm just speaking quickly from my own experience. Yeah, I think our job is to be present and offer that loving compassion of God. We listen to people. We accompany people. Sometimes that means we're the butt of their anger.
That's true. Yeah.
Yori, you have a comment that you have written in chat. Would you like to read your comment?
Well, this is my comment actually. I myself always believe that because Jesus is God and God is love, that's why even though Jesus, he incarnated to be a human being, but because he's God, that's why he goes beyond everything, even beyond the ethnicity, beyond the nationality. And we know that Jesus is love, and we know him as love of God, and we know him also that we are loved by him unconditionally. But oftentimes, we probably fail to love people, or even we probably fail to love our comforts as we have been loved by Jesus unconditionally. And the problem is not only going beyond our culture or ethnicity or nationality, but also to love people, to love real people, especially to love our comforts, our parishioners, just like what Mike Manning used to say, with the love of Jesus. We love people with the love of Jesus. Love that's not only talk, ideally or theoretically, but love that is performed in practical sense, something that you can feel and people can also sense.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Yori. Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, why are we doing this in terms of interculturality? Because God is a God of love, and that we are in God's image. And then therefore, how do we show that love inclusively of all peoples? And thank you very much. Yeah. Steve, you want to make any comment here?
Well, I could say, one thing, even if Jesus is wrong, if you take, the perspective that you took, Raj, he was clearly wrong. Our faith is that he is, like us in all things, even our prejudices, but without sin.
Right.
So when he's called on it, he recognizes it. And I think that's really helpful for us, is that, we are racists, we are prejudiced, we are, us and them, but we can change. Jesus was exactly like us, probably a little bit better, but exactly like us, and he changed, and so we can change. I think that's the point of the story.
Good, thank you. Okay, are there any other questions or reflections here?
I don't see any other comment or question.
Okay.
Roger, maybe you can already share us the screen for the question that you have for reflection for us.
Okay, let me see if I can do this again here. Just a moment. Let me do this again. Share screen. Okay, let's see here. There we are. Okay. So the question for group sharing today, and Dung, are you going to post this also? You'll post this on the chat as well, right?
Yeah, I will post a question on the chat as well.
Okay, so that way you can refer to the question. So he'll post it in the chat So when you're in your small groups, you can see it. So how do you see the relationship between an intercultural lifestyle and a call to move towards those on the margins of our communities and societies? This is a connection between our odd intra and our odd extra, our lifestyle and our ministry. And what kind of new insights may a stranger offer to us? What kind of new practices can we build together? Okay. So what kind of new insights may a stranger offer to us? What kind of new practices can we build together with whoever we consider as a stranger in that way? So this would be the questions for the group sharing, and Dung will be posting it in the chat as well. Okay, I can leave it up here for a little bit, but later on I can take it down. Okay, all right, I think that's all. Dung, do you have anything else to say at this point about the schedule?
Yes, right now we will be taking a break. So I invite you to take a break and also take a little time to reflect on this question for the group sharing. Take a little time to kind of let the question truly be an experience of like reflecting or lifting out your own personal experience in these questions, so that when you share in a group, it become very naturally, we share in different groups as a district or different communities. So right now, I invite you to begin already, do your break, and I will invite all of you to leave your connection on, because I will be moving each one of you into your respective district, so that you can share later on when you come back at 11 a.m. 11 a.m. is when we do the group sharing. So thank you, everyone. Hope I will see you in a little while.
Okay, good, good.
That's mute and unmute right there. You see that? What you are talking, you can hear.
Hi, Don. How are you doing?
Very good. Very good. Very good. Okay.